My presentation is the uncodifiableness of any constitutional order. What I want to talk about is what the question is. This leads us to two fundamental questions. First of all, what is the Constitution or a constitution, and what is meant by uncodifiable in this sense? When our organizer asked us to do this paper, I was kind of like, he was really interested in unwritten constitutions, okay, the British and the Israeli and things like this, and the difference between this tradition and that. But then he uses this word codifiable to explain it, and it kind of threw me. Because this is a very, because as well, what is meant by the term uncodifiable in a sense? And I therefore tried to look at these two different issues and try to address the problem. First, let's address the concept of constitution, right? Well, the history of the concept of what a constitution is in itself originates at the beginning of the first attempt by man to understand political order, human political order and political ruling. We know no similar the earliest concept that we would use to call constitution would be framed by the Greek word politeia, okay, which we see no similar word in Hebrew, we see no in Sumerian, we see no similar word in the old Chinese text about the time. They only had rule, or empire, or dominion, or something like this. The term politeia is a structure of identity. Now, the Greek term had a double meaning ultimately. When later writers talk about it, they would refer to it with regarding a system, a general system by which one framed a political community, how the various nature of the political community would direct and shape, or it would talk about a specific type. Now, when we get to the Latin usage of it, then this becomes a big problem, because the way this was translated in Latin was res publica. Okay. And for the Latin, at first, this meant the political thing, okay? But then the meaning changed. The meaning, instead of it echoed the double, it lost the first meaning, the more general meaning, and it basically became, in our language, our political language, the res publica became understood as one version of political rule. Okay. So therefore, this becomes a problem because we lose the meaning. And then by the current usage of the idea of constitution to this term emerges out of the French. It emerges literally out of the French and the influence of the Norman conquest into the origins into English. So therefore, the word constitution comes from the way the legal norms or structure. Now, this also meant, originally, the term constitution meant literally in the English, it meant your condition. The expression is, I'm going for my morning constitutional, right? This meant what? This is about your health, your well-being. Your constitution was your health. It was your condition of your thing. This is the origin of the word constitution. And the French, therefore, to use this term as the political form gives our understanding of what, this is why you could translate politeia as constitution, because this is what was meant in that sense of any political health of a community, the health and well-being of the community. The classic definition of we can divide any constitutional structure in regards to basic, it's like he says, the basic framework that defines the nature and the conduct of political authority. The functions of government, the structures of government, and procedures of government. Therefore, any constructions of this deals, any constitutional framework must, at least in the sense, deal with this. But there's a problem here. But this is the modern view. This is the modern statist definition of this. What it does, it assumes that what it's dealing with here is law. Okay, so it points us to the question of the codifiable questions. Hence, this is the double-edged sword here. The two varieties of constitutions. When written constitution, which means really a meta structure, right? A meta structure under the laws that govern any given political unit operates, and it operates from a top-down approach, right? Even though many of the people may make it, the meta structure becomes the top-down authority by which all things come downwards, okay? Or an unwritten tradition. The unwritten tradition, in this sense, is kind of the way the laws and agreements of a given political community enact day-to-day operations of civic structure. That this is an emergent order. The concept of emergent order emerges in the thinking of economists like Hayek, but also in evolutionary biology. This is, in other words, that an emergent order, in other words, norms or metastructure will come not from a position of will or deliberative act, but rather the habits, the interactions and habits will create over time a certain periods of behaviors that become normative over time, and become binding over time. And therefore, this is how emergent order emerges. Emergent order is an order that comes out from practice and everyday structure. Okay? So and we would argue that the English Constitution and the Israeli Constitution and other kind of uncodifiable or non-written constitutions are more kind of emergent in their characteristics. While written constitutions, even though they might have come out of an emergent moment, what happens is that emergent moment may then have codified them as a norm by which, from that point on, the system, the given community is to follow and bind it. We need to talk about this. Now, the question of the uncodifiable comes up here next. And this is a big problem about what we mean by uncodifiable. Literally, therefore, let's look at what uncodifiable means, not codifiable. That's the term of it. Therefore, we looked at what does codifiable means. The standard English definition of codifiable is to organize or arrange something systematically in writing. Okay. Therefore, but wait a minute, our understanding of non-codifiable is unwritten, right? So therefore, we assume it's unwritten, but codifiableness is written, and non-codifiable is something, the things that can't be organized or systematically arranged. So, but wait a minute. When we say unwritten constitutions, then most of them have written capacities, and they're systematic. They're not systematic from the top, but they emerge in system. In other words, this is the problem. We assume that if something that is not coming top down has no order. That's not true. Anyone in science, the human sciences will tell you that there's a thing called emergent order, and that emergent order helps you understand that even something that may appear chaotic actually isn't chaotic because there's a ordered logic system underneath it. So therefore, this is the question we get from this, but are unwritten constitutions really not codifiable? And the answer question is no, they are codifiable. So therefore, we can't, when we talk about non-codifiable constitutionalism, this is kind of an oxymoron in one sense. But there is something. That is, if we understand, we get beyond, go back here, we get beyond this three characteristic aspect of the codifiable versus uncodifiable. These functions, the function of government and its construction, the structure of the government, these may not be specified either in law or in a statute. Rather, they could be, these often require codification and statute in non-constitutional systems. In other words, certain practices have to be codified in law. But something beyond these three. Something beyond these three. So therefore, there's something beyond the Constitution. So back to the thing was, what is the uncodifiable and the unconstitutional order? Well, the first literal thing is the territory and the character of the place a people lives. That is one of the first, in other words, the space, the actual space. Political life requires an actual space. The land and the territory as defines a people as much as anything else. Okay, it defines the possibility of what is possible in a given community. So therefore, this is in one way something uncodifiable. It is a given that these are the kind of a priori givens of any political system, of any political order. So the territory, the land, the kind of character, the fact that you have rivers, the fact that these things are going to be, if you have navigatable rivers and certain things, you're going to have a certain way of life. If you don't have easily navigable rivers, it's going to be much more difficult for you to engage in commerce and trade. If your land is high, are you a mountainous people with very little specific agricultural land, or do you have large plains which large amounts of agricultural land? Are you resource? Do you have areas of resources? Do you have access to the sea? All these issues will define the possibilities by which the nature of your political system will be able to succeed or fail, operate and prosper. Another aspect of this is the culture and language of people. Language matters. Why? Because language shapes our understanding of the world, and different languages work differently. Politics is very much in ruling and communication differs, and meanings of things differ because of different languages. One of the things I've noticed this when I look at Polish things, in many ways, Polish language, the Polish language of politics is still very much pre-modern. It lacks many of it echoes the Latin and Roman traditions of the First Commonwealth, the First Republic. You still engage in much of the things that you lack many of the terms of state of the modern state. In other words, in many ways, Polish languages. When I look at translations of very terms like państwo, it points to something that predates the modern conception of the state, of the statified state law, state structures. It's in fact, you see things that are much more. Even terms nation and things like this are in there, but they're uncomfortable in the system. So therefore the language, and therefore this is a problem. If you're trying to if your language isn't already, does not exist for the lot of things, what happens? When you adopt these statist structures, they're going to linguistically appear alien or foreign. And therefore, there's not going to be much acceptance or much permission of it. So therefore, like the culture of a people, the language of a people, these two, the cultures and traditions and things, are kind of fundamental, non-codifiable a prioris that will fundamentally shape the constitutional order. Last but not least, the systems of belief and values of a people or community. That this is going to be very important. What do most politics is about? What? Collective goods and perceptions of what is just, right? Achievement of collective goods and trying to achieve collective utility, collective benefit, and the idea of achieving what is just and orderly and peaceful and stable among people. The questions of equity and stability, right? The questions of fairness and equity. Okay, these things are tied to people's belief structures, and the nature of belief is a very problematic thing, in the sense that it is not something that it is something that is both at one level rational but also irrational. Okay, it is something that is emergent, but also can be imposed. It has characteristics of emergent development. They evolve, but then at a certain time, certain principles come in from a top and are shaped based upon belief or rational assertion a priori, which then reframe the world. So therefore, you have an aspect of the uncodifiable of this. And the last characteristic of this, of the uncodifiable aspects, is the inherent nature of an office or function. In other words, certain institutions, certain structures over time, certain functions and things are going to have the nature of the system itself, the institution itself, to it. Example would be, let's say, an office. The prerogative power of offices, usually heads of states, be it a king or an archon, the archons of the ancient world, or the kings, the basileus, or rex in the Latin world, or then later the emperor, or then the heads of state, people who become the concept of heads of state, which can be either a minister or a president, right? These people exercise at that level a certain function of authority, prerogative, that comes with the office, and that they're off. And this, in the American experience, like a lot of the presidential powers were unspecified in the Constitution. Why? Because they didn't want to piss off George Washington. Everyone agreed at Philadelphia, Washington was going to be a president, but Washington was a picky fellow. So therefore, to get Washington to do the job, they couldn't define it too well. And then what happened? The way the presidency in America operated was that it defined it. So therefore, in many ways, your constitution, if you define institutions too strictly at the constitutional level, there's no room for evolution. What was so unique about the Polish constitution, the way it was worked, was that really didn't allow. It did and it didn't allow for a kind of ways. In fact, I would argue the Polish presidency is much more powerful than the American presidency. Much more. I mean, my God, imagine the ability to intervene and interrupt the same as much as possible. I mean, a very aggressive president could basically frustrate legislative power if he didn't like it. If he didn't like the majority of what was the same was doing, he could exercise significant interruption of the same legally. And it would be and the same itself would have to resort to appealing to the tribune of state to limit him, which is interesting. Again, the problem of judicial power. One of my problems with the Polish constitution is there's no clear judicial power. It's divided and constrained among these 3 to 4 different high courts that don't have, and there's no real, the argument that the constitutional tribunal has real thing. No, this is what I call a foreign. This is bringing an American conception of the Supreme Court and the German court system and viewing the Polish constitutional structure in light of this alien and constitutional understanding. So therefore, we have to always look at the functions of offices and their inherent characteristics. A judicial office is supposed to what? Adjudicate. It is supposed to settle disputes and do this. If your judicial office doesn't function well, there's going to be a problematic aspect of this. And therefore, this leads us to the problems that come out of this situation. First, the problem is the problem of the people and its organizations. Now, this is something I've been looking into. This is the question of the concept of community versus society. We in English tends to conflate these concepts. But these concepts are not, in the Latin, they're very different. The community is more organic, more close-knit. It's a very involuntary. It is a much more cohesive construct of local communities and local entities, where society is more voluntary. Much more, the societas of the Latin was between different communities. Society was really understood as the interrelation or interaction, usually of trade or military deals. That's why there's no equivalent of societas in the Greek. The closest thing in the ancient Greek for societas would be treaties or alliances. Therefore, there's no. Therefore, the ancient world only thought, at least the Greeks, only saw political rule at the level of community. At the level of society, there could be no political rule. That there could be economic activity and coercive relations by hegemonic power. In other words, could be dominion, despotic. You could master other communities, or have economic relations with them, but it was not viewed politically. It is only with Rome that the Romans expand on this concept, and with Cicero's attempt in his later life to argue that there could be the political form could be attached to the society. That doesn't work. The empire rules just like the Greek states ruled other states, Greek cities, other cities, and other things. But it is with the rise of the modern state. The modern state is the instrument by which society is to be structured. Whereas for the ancient world, it was the polis or the civitas, right? This is the classic definition. So therefore, this is the question: how do you organize it? How is the political organization going to be? Are the ancients right that only real politics happen at the community local level? Or are we moderns right and argue that this new definition of politics is not concerned with, let's say, it's more voluntary, it's more consensual, it's more based upon economic interest and utility, and not concerned so much about sharing this, living together and sharing the same values and ways of life. In other words, there's going to be a lot more diversity and disagreement in a society because you're not going to have the same need to have this to regulate your neighbors. In other words, in any small community, there's always going to be a peer pressure to normalize and conform. At a society, this is too large, and that can't happen. It won't merge the same way. Therefore, if you want to create a community at the level of society, you're going to have to exercise a lot of oppression, and therefore, it's going to violate the character of a society. It's going to be more coercive and less economic. The next aspect is political union or nation. Now, this is a very interesting aspect. Is the political form or is the form of the constitutional order going to be struck within the concept of a nation, which is an ethno-linguistic frame? And much of the European states developed because of the ethno-linguistic and religious constructions by which they emerged. The Westphalian order is perfect. The Westphalian order is not necessarily. It's more the interstate relationship, but it's also the way how states themselves will emerge. In other words, that we're going to allow a situation that states emerge and they're going to be left alone and they're going to be equally amongst each other. Or political union. Political union argues that communities on themselves will operate. In other words, the communities will happen. And what will happen is the political union of these communities will occur. And what happens is that there's going to be a union of this, but is the union going to be a homogeneous one or a heterogeneous one? If it's a homogeneous one, what happens is you have to usually impose great coercion. Okay? But if you're a heterogeneous one, often this requires an emergent order, or therefore what ends up happening is less coercion and more cooperation, and therefore less ruling from the center. So therefore, this is a problem about this. And this is the problem of the American experience before the Civil War, which was resolved by a civil war, and then even after the Civil War, it was never completely homogenous. Now, because of the courts, we can say that of this. But the European conception of the EU, how the states are coming together into a body politic, and even though most people in Europe don't see the EU as a state, it's denial. But what is the EU but a state? It walks like taxes, it regulates, it enforces slowly and efficiently, but it still enforces. It quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it's a duck. And last but not least, the nature, another problem that arises, the nature of constitutional jurisprudence and the character of political rule. In other words, the changing nature of these things. And these are three problems. The first problem is the rise of normativism. This is a problem of basically later modern legal thing. This is the idea, this is very much a continental problem, and it happens within the unitary continental states, that the law should override prerogative powers. That rulers and exercisers should only, that prerogative have, that should, any prerogative power that is not specified by law is verboten. Okay? This is very much the German problem. This defined much of what happened in the Weimar Constitution, which left a lot of authority aspects on prerogative. But then the German nature of post-Kantian legal theory made, because post-Kantian legal theory privilegizes specific law over executive authority, prerogative. And therefore, what happened here was that the rise of normative demands that the law, the written law, needs to prevail over the executive prerogative, and needs to, and therefore what happens is you need to codify the exception, which is always bad. You know, anyone who knows the nature of law, law should always be general. Once you specify specific aspects of law to apply specific situations, you make bad law. The second fundamental change that happens is the rise of judicial rule. That is, instead of letting political bodies, deliberative political bodies, make political decisions, deliberative political bodies, in order to escape the cost consequences of them, have often reverted to judicial bodies or third-party entities to settle these disputes. So therefore, the courts become the institution that defines the issue, that becomes the final authoritative element. But the problem with the courts is that the courts are not elected. The courts are not an elected political body. The courts are supposed to be a body that is actually, the only thing that's there is to settle disputes. It is there to codify and enforce disputes, and acts as a judge in cases of dispute and also cases of the violation of the law. Rise of the judicial rule, that judicial rule goes beyond the scope of judicial power, that it starts all of a sudden embracing legislature, acting as legislature. This changes the fundamental character of a political system. And the danger here is this, that because there's a tendency to rely on judicial interpretation versus the letter of the law. One of the biggest negative consequences of American history of the past 70 years has been the basically making the Constitution basically just a thing, symbol, not a reality. It's not like, I mean, the Obama presidency made it clear he didn't care about a provision of the Constitution. The Supreme Court even made it clear when it in the case of when Justice Roberts ruled that the American Care Act, which in the text says it's a mandate, not a tax. The text of the bill that he's giving, and he says, "Oh, that doesn't mean, they don't mean that. It's really a tax, and therefore it's perfectly constitutional." Again, the court therefore changed the meaning by interpretation of the letter of the law. You tie this with judicial rule. The power of the rise of judicial interpretation leads to the total undermining of the political order. It creates a rule, it destroys democracy, it makes democracy all but impossible. It makes the rule of the people, or even Republican rule, meaningless in that sense. And what happens is you have the rule of the unelected, the rule of an elite, and given European tendencies, these elites are often, the judicial entities are often self-selected. So you have a unelected, self-selecting priesthood imposing an order over a democratically elected people. This is a recipe. This is a recipe in the Aristotelian and older tradition. This would be a kind of extreme oligarchy, almost bordering on tyranny. And therefore, this is the problem about this. So the uncodifiableness, this is an aspect of all these things I'm talking about are the uncodifiable character of the debate and the understanding of constitution. So that therefore, the rise of normatism, this is a habit. In other words, this is not codified anywhere. This is not normalized by law. Rather, this is a habit of the elites in the system. The rise of judicial rule. Again, this is not codified. It's a political habit that happened over time. That the legislative bodies, the legislature could easily castrate the court in America. It is so easy that the impeachment power alone of the court, the power of the Congress to define the courts and also to regulate it, because given most decisions at the Supreme Court here are appellate, not original, so therefore they can be the Congress has the Constitution, the text of the Constitution gives to the Congress the absolute power to regulate the appellate and mean that they can specify how they interpret it. And the takes the judges sentencing guidelines in the inferior courts. They constrain judicial power when it suits the congressional interest. The congressional authority reduces judicial power. For some reason, for the Supreme Court, the question is it the myth of the Supreme Court that we've dealt as the sole protector of the Constitution, or is it in the interest of elites to have this body do what it does? And from this American context, we can see the implications in the larger dimensions of the rise of this. And it becomes, again, this is political change and revolution will happen, again, not only through the legal formal means, but also through these behaviors and patterns that occur, the so-called non-codifiable. Now, at this point, I will stop my presentation, and I will revert. I'm not sure if I went over my time. I apologize. I didn't hear it. I didn't get a flag from the boss, so I don't know. So.